Okay, we're on.
Hi there to the people that are just joining us. Just to give you a heads up, we're just still letting people in, and we'll be formally starting at midday. So if you've got a few minutes, we do have a few minutes left. So yeah, you've got time to make a cup of tea if you like. To the people just joining us, thank you, and we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Okay, Damien, are you ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We might make a start. So yes, welcome today to Moonee Valley's Council's Solar and Battery Workshop event, which is being delivered as part of Council's free Green Living Workshop program. Before I begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of Moonee Valley land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past and present. My name is Deanna Vidovic and I'm a Sustainability Officer with Moonee Valley City Council. So you will be on mute for this session. However, we would encourage you to use the chat function, use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions. And if you have technical issues, could you please use the chat function, and I will try to address them as best as I can. So also the presentation will be divided into two parts. The first part will be about solar PV, and the second part will be on battery storage. So Damien will address questions from the audience via the Q&A box at the end of each part. If you can't stay for the whole session, we are recording it and we'll be making it available shortly. And so for privacy purposes, only myself and Damien will be visible in this recording. So Damien Moyes is our presenter today. Damien is from Renew and is responsible for Renew's advocacy, policy and advice, and works in the areas of renewable energy, energy efficiency, demand management, water conservation and efficient transport. He has qualifications in urban and regional planning and environmental management, and has worked across government and the private sector. On that note, I'd like to welcome Damien. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deanna. I'm just going to swap over the presentation here and make sure that's showing correctly. Is that, oh, I just need to resize the window frame here. Does that look okay?
That looks fine, yep.
Great. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for attending today and for having me come along. I hope you're all faring well and enjoying a bit warmer weather, and looking forward to coming out of what's been an interesting year. Yeah, very happy to talk to you today about solar and battery systems. As Deanna said, you know, we'll sort of split it up into two. I know that people, you know, increasingly these days are pretty familiar with solar, particularly solar PV systems, and probably less so with batteries. So the way I've structured the presentation is going to spend a little bit more time in the second half on batteries and storage systems, and we're going to try and leave plenty of time for Q&A as well. So I hope to kind of help you with the specific questions that you've got. If you haven't heard of Renew before, a quick plug on that. So we're an organisation, we're a member-based organisation, a not-for-profit. We've been around for about 40 years. Our members are basically residential consumers, householders looking at green technology, and we're all about trying to provide them good quality, independent, accurate information to help them make decisions about a whole variety of different green technologies and sustainable practices, solar batteries just being one. You may have seen a couple of magazines that we do. We do 2 quarterly magazines, Renew and Sanctuary. Renew focuses on technology and sort of DIY and those kind of things, and Sanctuary is really about kind of showcases modern green homes, building high ESD building design. The main thing I wanted to say about us is we're independent. We don't actually sell solar and battery and other systems. So I'm not here to try and convince you to buy one or to convince you to go with a specific technology or supplier, but just here to try and help provide information as best we can. So yeah, presentation, as I said, is in 2 parts. Really, we're going to, in terms of solar, just talk a bit about how does it work, cover where sort of rebates and feed-in tariffs are currently at, because they do keep changing from time to time, and how to get the most out of your system and how to get a good quality one and those kind of questions. And then in the second half to cover batteries, look at how do they work in a bit more detail and how they can benefit you. First couple of things I like to do with any of these presentations, you know, solar and batteries are one way to reduce energy bills or reduce your carbon footprint. There's a few other things to be aware of when you're thinking about energy management overall. One is your retail tariff. So Victoria has a very, what they call competitive market for electricity and gas. There's lots of retailers around, and you can obviously switch retailers and get a better deal, get a lower tariff and save money. This is something that we certainly recommend. Things like solar and batteries and other energy efficiency technologies, at the end of the day, they all cost money, and changing tariffs doesn't actually cost you anything. The best tariff comparator website is the Victorian government's one. It's called Victorian Energy Compare, and the link is there. We constantly save people you know, $100, $200, $300 a year. A while ago, I saved a lady $600 a year just by changing retailers, and there's no upfront cost to do so. So really recommend doing that as part of your overall sort of energy approach. And the other one is sort of the appliance side of things. You know, appliances don't last forever. Your white goods and your energy systems, they tend to wear out after time. And when you're coming up for those appliance replacement decisions, have a look at the energy performance and also the water performance of different products on the market and see if you can get a more efficient one next time round. Often they don't cost that much more to get higher efficiency, and they'll actually perform better over time, usually better quality as well, and save you in terms of energy use and bills and carbon as well. Solar PVs, that's what we're going to focus on here. Just quickly, what specifically we're talking about. I'm not really talking about solar hot water. I'm talking about the solar panels that generate electricity, so solar photovoltaic panels, or solar PV for short. What are they? It's basically a bunch of panels that sit on the roof, solar cells that generate electricity. That's fed into an inverter. Solar panels generate in DC. The inverter converts that to AC, so you can actually use it in the house. It's fed into your switchboard, and then that electricity can be used in the house to run your appliances. And of course, any excess that's left over that your appliances don't need will go into the grid. In regards to solar PV, this is the one that's been pretty popular, pretty common now for the last decade in Australia. So around 20% of Australian houses, a bit more than that now, have it. It's highly economically attractive, increasingly so. That's a big reason why a lot of people have got it. But of those systems, very few of those systems actually have batteries coupled to those systems at this point. Just to touch on this quickly, this is your classic sort of residential, what we call load profile. So this is a day. You can see AM and PM across the slide there. Not all residential profiles are the same, but they tend to follow a fairly similar pattern in which there's not a lot of energy use overnight, particularly your sort of Melbourne and Victorian homes. You get up in the morning, there's sort of energy activity, electricity activity in the morning, and a bit of a small peak in the morning. And then a lot of people typically don't use that much electricity at all during the day. And then you get that evening peak often occurring from around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right through till 9, 10, 11 at night. And often, easily 50% and more of your actual daily electricity use happens in the evening time. What happens with solar PV? Solar PV generates electricity when the sun shines. It does it during the day. It starts off, 7, 8, 9 a.m. in the morning, generate a little bit, and then that curve really kicks up, as you can see in the slide there. The yellow is your generation, peaking in the middle of the day, peaking in the peak sun hours, which in summer might be, between sort of 10 and 4, and in winter might only be between, 12 and 2. And so what happens is you get a bit of a mismatch there. Solar generates a lot of electricity, but not necessarily when you are using electricity in the house. So you can see in that slide there, the real yellow, strong yellow portion underneath the blue curve. That's essentially the solar electricity that you would use on site to run your appliances. And the excess solar generation portion above the blue curve, the light yellow, that's the bit that's going to the grid. And we often find that homes, particularly Melbourne and Victorian homes, export a lot of the solar generation, 60, 70, 80% of the solar electricity goes to the grid, and you get paid a feed-in tariff for that rather than offsetting the retail tariff that you pay your energy retailer. Why do people do it? Obviously a few different reasons, mainly environmental or economic. On the environment side, absolutely, solar PV has a direct environmental benefit. It offsets the consumption from polluting generators, your large centralized generators and other more emissions intensive generators in the grid. And it does that whether or not you use the electricity in your house or it goes out to the grid and your neighbour uses it. At the end of the day, it's all renewable generation, and it reduces the emissions intensity of the grid. From an embodied energy point of view, that's the amount of energy that was required to actually manufacture the solar cells. That's pretty good these days. Most cells solar panels are really about 12 to 18 months, what we call embodied energy payback time. So they'll generate the same amount of electricity or same amount of energy that was used to actually put the system together in generally less than 18 months. And these systems generate electricity for 20 and 25 and 30 years and beyond. The economics, obviously the other big reason, and this has sort of just gotten better and better over the years. This is just some rough calcs that we did a couple of years ago. The payback time or the return on investment is actually a bit better than this at the moment, particularly with the Victorian rebates that I'll talk about in a minute. But basically, you know, it's slightly different for different types of homes and ones that have a different load profile or appliance mix. But generally we find that a solar PV system in Melbourne or in Victoria will pay for itself generally within about 4 to 8 years on current prices and the current performance of the system. So that's pretty good. This graph here shows that, you know, once that these are different system sizes, and essentially once you pay it off, which might be, in this case here, you're talking about sort of systems that pay themselves off in 4 to 5 years, the system's still there for another 20 odd years after that and generates enormous economic value over that time. You can see the large 8 kilowatt system there, you know, generating almost $35,000 worth of what we call net benefits over that 30-year period. So they are pretty economically attractive. Rebates, there's really two types of rebates to mainly worry about. And the first one you don't need to worry about too much. The first one is called Small Technology Certificates, STCs. This is in line with the federal government renewable energy target policy, which has been around since 2001. It's been discounting the cost of renewable energy since then. This scheme, it discounts solar PV, it discounts efficient hot water systems, small wind turbines, micro hydro systems, but solar PV is the dominant technology. And it discounts the cost by about 20%, give or take. You don't need to worry about this. When you actually get quotes for solar PV, this is included in the quote. It's handled by the installer, and you'll see a full price, and then you'll see a discounted price from the installer. So that's good. The other rebate, which is worth spending a bit more focus on, is the state government Victorian rebate, which is administered by Solar Victoria. So this is a straight rebate. It's been around now probably for 18 months or so, maybe a bit more. And this is a secondary rebate you can get for solar PV. It's currently set at $1,850. So that's in addition to the federal government rebate. But there is some more detailed eligibility criteria. The main two aspects of that being that your household income can't be more than $180,000 per year, and that's household, not individual. And the home has to be valued at less than $3 million, and I think they use the council rates notice for that. And of course, you can't have existing solar. The great thing is it's available not only to homeowners, but renters as well, and they're also offering interest-free loans too for part of the rest of the purchase price of the system. So this can really ramp down the cost of solar PV systems. You can be talking about sort of a medium size 5-6 kilowatt system now with this rebate costing down around sort of, you know, $3,500, maybe $4,000, which is very cheap for a system that size. Solar Victoria also offers other rebates. The other key one is the solar hot water rebate, which is up to $1,000 for eligible hot water systems, which largely includes solar hot water or heat pump hot water systems. Same criteria around the household income and home value. And also, if you're swapping out a hot water system, it's got to be more than 3 years old, otherwise you won't be eligible. This one's for existing homes, so it's really about replacing inefficient gas or inefficient electric hot water systems. And of course, you can only get one or the other. You can get the PV one or the hot water one, but not both. Just while we're on rebates, there is a battery rebate in Victoria. The rebate itself is a very high level. It's a bit over $4,000. However, there's not many rebates, and not all postcodes actually qualify for the rebate. They've targeted this more at sort of greenfield sites and areas that are having a bit of trouble with the electricity grid side of things. I have checked, there's a big postcode list on Solar Victoria's site. I didn't see certainly the Moonee Ponds postcode and one or two of the others in that list, but it's worth checking that and sort of rechecking it down the track in case that rebate offer expands, because this is a good way of getting into storage where, you know, household batteries are still relatively expensive. If you're going to get one, it's got to be from the approved battery list. It's actually got to be a retrofit system. So you need to have existing solar PV already, and you need to be willing to participate in some of the trials that are going on that sort of aggregate a lot of the batteries in the market and try and provide benefits to network management. So that's the main rebates to be aware of. On the feed-in tariff side of things, firstly, what is a feed-in tariff? Well, this is the amount that you get paid for the solar electricity that gets exported into the grid. So obviously you pay your electricity retailer for electricity you buy from the grid. You generally pay for that on a cents per kilowatt hour basis, and also on a fixed daily charge basis. The feed-in tariff is the reverse of the energy charge. So for the kilowatt hours that you put into the grid from the solar system, you'll get paid an amount per kilowatt hour. Now, feed-in tariffs have been around in Victoria since really about 2008. They started off very high. People may be familiar with the old 60-cent premium feed-in tariff, and that was set at a time when solar literally cost 10 times, the technology cost 10 times more than it does now. So what's happened over the last 10 years is that the feed-in tariffs have reduced quite significantly, but the cost of the technology has reduced. And actually, when you look at the overall economics, solar PV is more economically attractive now than it was when the premium feed-in tariffs used to be in place. So over the years, the feed-in tariffs have reduced. The feed-in tariff is largely set by the Essential Services Commission, which is a part of the Victorian government, which sort of regulates the price, and it tells the electricity retailers that they must pay you a minimum price for your electricity exports from solar. And currently that price in this financial year is around 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Some of the retailers will pay a little bit more than that, so it's worth having a look around and seeing what retailers are offering, and you can see that on that tariff comparator website I put up earlier as well. There's talk, and there's also a framework for kind of time varying feed-in tariffs. They're getting paid a feed-in tariff at different levels during different times of the day. The policy framework for that is there, but we're not seeing a lot of retailers actually offering those types of tariffs. So most of the ones you'll see will be the flat rate. Choosing a supplier, it's always a bit tricky. I mean, solar's it's a piece of technology. It is a bit complex. How do you go about choosing a supplier? There's a few different ways. You know, one way we like to say is that if you've got, you know, family or friends or work colleagues who've actually done solar PV and had a pretty good experience with the install and with the ongoing operation of the system, then that's not a bad place to start, getting quotes from the installers that they used. If you don't have that, what we generally recommend is starting with the Clean Energy Council's approved solar retailer program. There's thousands of solar installers around Australia, but some of them are signatories to an industry code of conduct that's managed by the CEC. The web address solaraccreditation.com.au is up there at the moment, and you can see a list of suppliers that are actually signatories to that code, and that means that they need to give you minimum warranty levels and have standard contractual terms and conditions, and meet certain marketing practices, and they get regulated to a higher level. So that's a good place to start. The other thing when you're getting quotes is obviously to check the warranties. Solar panels have different parts to the warranty. You get warranties on the panels themselves for both their performance and also their sort of what we'd call a defect or failure warranty over time. You get a separate warranty for the inverter, and then you actually get a warranty too for the workmanship and the installation by the installer. So the panel and inverter warranties are really manufacturer led warranties, whereas your installer will also offer you a warranty for their workmanship. So good to compare those. There's also a couple of online spots where you can get multiple quotes to start with, and I've got a couple of links up there. Solar Quotes and Solar Choice do offer those services. How do you best plan for it? Well, we actually, through Renew, offer what we call an energy consult, and that's where we get into a bit of detail around optimizing a system design and helping you with quotes and reviewing those. Takes a few hours to do. Generally what we do, particularly in Victoria, is grab your meter data and grab your bills and run it through a model. And then we can do this for solar and for batteries as well. And we look at a few different system sizes and designs and work out an optimal level for you. We can talk to you about what your future plans might be and whether or not, you might be thinking about doing a renovation or converting to an all-electric home or having an EV and how that might affect your energy loads. And so with the consult, essentially, we're sort of doing a bit of analysis for your site specifically, and then we sit down with you for about an hour and talk through the options and then help you actually obtain quotes and review those and get a system that's right for you. With our consults, what do we find people ask? They ask questions like, can I go off grid, or can I get rid of my electricity retailer? We tend not to start at that point. We can talk about those things, but generally what we try and start with is, not only the solar, but we try and get an understanding of how much energy you're actually using, both gas and electricity, across the home on sort of an annual basis, and what you're actually paying per year. How much does stationary energy actually cost you per year? What's your current appliance mix? Where are your old appliances? What might you need to be changing over in the next few years, 5 years? And talk to you about your real priorities as well. Are you trying to do it for economic reasons, environment? Are you needing to increase reliability? Is there other reasons there? And we've also helped out renters as well, and having discussions with landlords about what's possible. If you're looking for a bit of free initial advice, there's a free solar and battery calculator on our website. The web link is down the bottom there. You go to that page and answer a few questions about your electricity use. You don't need to put in any details in terms of bills or what have you, and you get sent an immediate report which shows you different system sizes and costs and benefits and different options, and it's sort of a start before you can get into the quotation phase. And the last slide I'm just going to talk to here is really just around, how do you get the best out of your solar system? I mean, at the start, as I sort of showed, the real benefit, particularly the energy and the economic benefit, is using most of that solar electricity on site, and most households don't use that much electricity during the day, particularly Victorian households where they might be running, or they typically are running their big loads like heating and hot water on gas and not on electric at all. So, obviously the idea is to run more electric appliances during the day, during that sort of, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. sort of time window. You can turn things on manually or set things on timers to do that. Hot water is a great one. Hot water is one of your two main energy loads overall, particularly in Victoria, in our colder climate. If you can have an electric system, possibly either a heat pump or even a resistive technology system, if you've got a big enough solar system, and time that to run during the day, then essentially with a big enough solar system, you'll have free hot water. If you've got electric heating and or cooling, particularly reverse cycle, but even your kind of, panel radiators, plug-in radiators, those things you can run during the day and will soak up your solar electricity. And even for your larger kind of hydronic systems now, you can get heat pumps, which are electric-based, efficient technologies for those systems, which can also primarily run during the day from solar. Overall, once you start to get PV, you start to think about electricity more and more, and thinking about, whether or not all the opportunities that you might have to convert to an all-electric house. And the other big one down the track might even be an electric vehicle, which is a whole nother very large load itself and can easily work in very, very well with solar. So I think we might stop there in terms of the solar PV part. And Deanna, do we have questions?
Yes, we do. We only have one at this stage. So we've got Tia, who's asked the question about the question is, does the second rebate cover investment properties?
That's a good question. there's probably, and I'm not sure whether just it's only principal place of residence. I think it might be. I would need to check that, or maybe you need to check that on the site. The main thing there would be if you already have a system on your existing home, or you're wanting one in your existing home, then you certainly can't do both. Can you only do it on an investment property? I'm not sure on that. You'd need to check the eligibility criteria on the website. But my memory is that for programs that the Victorian government has led in the past, they have focused them on principal places of residence. So that may not be the case.
Okay, well, that's it for, oh no, we do have another question. Okay, so Logan's asked, have you got any tips for increasing the uptake of rooftop solar on rental properties?
Yeah, I mean, there are different options there. Obviously, it is more complex because you've got the split incentive issue. You know, the landlord typically pays for the system and the tenant benefits. Probably the biggest kind of hope, I think, in that space is some of the finance programs that are coming in. So what's called environmental upgrade agreements, where you can actually undertake a whole range of different either renewable or energy efficiency investments, and you're able to obtain finance through what's called environmental upgrade agreement, which is a financing mechanism done through local government, and it sits alongside or with your rates bill. So you can obviously defer the cost, given that it's finance, pay back the system over time. And if you do that with solar, generally what you'll find is the bill savings from day one will be larger than the repayments. And then that sort of makes it more attractive to landlords to start with. And then you can actually sort of look at, okay, well, how can the benefits of the solar system kind of be shared between the landlord and the tenant?
Great, thanks, Damien. Do you want to take a few more questions?
Yeah, let's do a couple more and then perhaps move on.
Okay. Richard's asked, can I install solar on my property before I rebuild the same property and move it across to the new one?
You could. I personally have moved the solar system before. I wouldn't really recommend it. If you're, it sounds as though you might be demolishing a house and building a new one. If it depends on your time frames a bit, but if you're only talking about sort of 12 to 18 months, I wouldn't bother doing the solar until the new building's built, or I would just get one for the property that you want to move it to. The reality is that moving a solar system is not cheap. You can't do it yourself. You're going to need a CEC accredited installer and a couple of them really to actually move the system. And the labour cost of doing that is going to be the same as installing a new system, really. The other thing is that the older that solar systems get, the standards keep changing. So one difficulty I had was trying to remove and then reconnect to the grid an older solar system, and got it done in the end, but it wasn't an easy process to do and almost wasn't able to do it. So it can be complex. I probably wouldn't make it too complex if you know which place in the end you want the solar system on for the long term.
Thanks, Damien. One more?
Yeah.
Okay. David's saying, I have existing solar, but think it's a pretty small system. How do I find out how many kilowatts it is, and can I get rebates to extend it?
You can certainly, you won't be able to get the Solar Victoria one, but you will be able to get the federal one. The challenge with, if you've got a smaller system, potentially it's an older system, it's not, you can't do something like, you can't just stick more panels on the older system and increase the capacity. Remember the inverter, mostly the inverter's size correctly for the panels that you've got. And so when you're talking about upgrading or increasing the overall capacity, generally you're talking about actually putting on a second separate system with its own inverter. You might be able to do that. To grid connect that, you would need to know from the electricity network that that's possible, and a good solar installer is going to know whether that's possible or not. But it's not entirely straightforward doing that. The other thing you can do is maybe, if it's a small enough system, disconnect the existing older system for the grid and use that for specific loads just in an off-grid sense, and get a new system, and you only have that one new system that's connected to the grid.
Thanks, Damien. We do have more questions, but we might leave them till later so that we can keep moving through this presentation. So for those of you that sent questions through, we will come back to them and address them after part 2. And if I could just remind people to type your questions into the Q&A chat function, which is just the box to the left of the chat function box. It's just got Q&A, if you can see that. All right, back to you, Damien. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll get into some batteries side of things. Now, just make sure that's showing okay. Hopefully you can see that okay. Yeah, household batteries. Let's just look at sort of what we're talking about here. So we talked about at the start, solar PV panels on the system. So essentially when we're talking about, we're talking about a grid connected household size battery here. So generally what you've got in these systems, you've still obviously got the solar panels, you've got an inverter, you've got possibly a couple of different types of inverters, which I'll get to in a minute. They can be a bit more fancy, a bit more sophisticated inverters. And you've got a battery connected to that inverter, or perhaps connected to a separate inverter. Now you'll often hear these called hybrid systems. The reason they're called hybrid is because then you're really reliant on your own stored energy, or you're reliant on the grid, and the inverter can kind of switch between the two. Now, if you remember the load profile and the solar generation curve that we looked at earlier on, here it is again. So you can see that the blue line is the sort of typical household usage pattern, and your yellow is the solar generation. When you add a battery, typically what happens is what's going on in the green there. So instead of exporting all of that solar electricity to the grid, which might have been 70 or 80% of the solar electricity, now you're putting at least some of that, hopefully most or all of that, into a battery. And that's the green bit, and you might still have that faint yellow a bit going out into the grid. And then later on in the evening peak, you can see that yellow sort of peak at the top. That's the battery discharging. So that's the solar energy stored in the battery. That's then the battery putting that energy back out so your appliances can use it in the evening peak. And then if the battery's large enough, the next morning, you can see in the AM there, your battery still might be discharging and able to meet some of your morning usage. But this all depends on the size of the solar system, the size of the battery system, how good the day is in terms of how sunny it was, and what time of season it is. So it starts to get into a bit more complex kind of design aspects. Why get a battery? Why are people doing it? Well, generally, obviously, they want to store that renewable energy for later use. They want to do that to get better on-site utilization out of their solar, and they want to really ramp down their use of electricity from the grid. So with a solar-only system, you can only really get to about 40–50% supplying your own energy needs, and you're still kind of 50% or more reliant on the grid. Once you add a battery, you can really ramp down your use of the grid. You might be 70, 80, 90% self-reliant, and you just need the battery largely in winter when the solar generation's lower. Obviously, that can help in terms of saving money on your overall peak consumption. Some people are putting it in for what they call tariff arbitrage, which is when you're buying electricity from the grid during off-peak times, and then avoiding, you use the battery electricity rather than the grid electricity at peak times. Blackout protection is a big one, particularly more so in regional areas rather than urban areas, where regional areas often have worse reliability, have more blackouts. And so some batteries, not all, but some battery systems can actually keep you going during a blackout, where your site will disconnect from the grid and you can keep your appliances on. More energy independence generally, so independence largely from the grid. You're really operating your own, you're relying on your own system primarily. Supporting a new technology, obviously, I mean, solar's been around for, 30 years in a big way, for really 15, whereas batteries, household batteries, and particularly lithium batteries, have really only been around for sort of 4 to 5 years. And so it's about, increasing the market share of that and improving the performance. And then also some people obviously set up systems to go completely off grid, and without a battery, you can't do that. Now, there's just a couple of basic concepts that I really wanted to talk about, which will help down the track in terms of understanding solar and batteries, and also actually other electrical appliances as well. Now, don't want to get too technical and get into sort of an engineering lesson, but it will help you just understand batteries a bit more when you're considering them. And that's this issue between what we call power and energy. So you would have heard of watts or kilowatts, and you would have heard of watt hours, or more likely kilowatt hours. Kilowatt hours is what we get charged on our electricity bills and what you get paid a feed-in tariff based on. Kilowatts is what we call a unit of power, and kilowatt hours is what we call a unit of energy. And I'm going to explain this, and you'll see how it works differently between solar and battery systems. So when you buy a solar PV system, its size will be rated generally in kilowatts. And in the example there, a 5 kilowatt solar system, that's a pretty common medium-sized system that a lot of households in Australia are putting in now. So what that means is that's the maximum power that system can generate or produce at any given moment. And it will only really do that when in the middle of the day, when the sun's shining and all the conditions are perfect for it to do that. Most of the time, it will actually generate less than its maximum capacity. So you can see there that we've got 5 kilowatt systems. It's midday, it's sunny, there's no clouds. That system, it instantaneously, over a second, will put out, hopefully, pretty close to 5 kilowatts of power. Now, if it does that for an hour, you can see our clock there is almost 1 o'clock. If it does that consistently for an hour, it will have put out 5 kilowatt hours of energy. And it's the energy, the kilowatt hours, that's actually the way that batteries are primarily communicated in terms of what you're actually buying. With solar, you're buying kilowatts, you're buying sort of kilowatts of capacity. With battery, you're buying, it's the energy capacity, the kilowatt hours of capacity. And I'll explain a bit more about that. So this is a kind of pretty common sort of household battery size. When you're looking at different batteries, mostly they'll be communicated in how many kilowatt hours can this battery store? How many kilowatt hours of energy can it hold? It will have what we call a maximum power output as well. So there'll be a maximum power that it can discharge at, and it's worth considering that too. But it's the kilowatt hours that will mostly be communicated in. So in this example here, we've got a battery that it can hold 10 kilowatt hours of energy, and it can put out 5 kilowatts of power instantaneously. So if it puts out 5 kilowatts of power for 2 hours, then the entire 10 kilowatt hours of energy will be discharged and the battery will fall to zero. There won't be any electricity left in it. However, things are a little bit more complicated than that. A really important metric to look at when you're looking at buying batteries is not the total capacity, but what is actually the usable capacity. So generally the way that batteries are designed is that they won't allow you to all discharge right down to zero. Lithium can go a lot further on that front than the older style batteries, but it's still important to understand what is actually the usable capacity, because that's the bit that you can actually take out of the battery and you can use in the house. So our battery of 10 kilowatt hours, that was the total capacity, but the usable capacity in terms of the way that it's designed may only be 8 kilowatt hours or 9 kilowatt hours. And so that's the bit that you've got to play with. So it's important to understand that. The next bit that's also important to understand is just because there's 8 kilowatt hours of usable capacity, that doesn't mean that you'll use 8 kilowatt hours every day. What happens is, your actual electricity usage profile, it actually varies quite a lot. It varies on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis. It varies on a daily basis, and it varies on a seasonal basis. So just because one day the battery, you perfectly sized it and you'll use the full 8 kilowatt hours running the appliances in the evening and perhaps in the next morning, the next day you may not be home, or you might have gone on holidays, or it might be a better day solar-wise, or it might be a really poor day solar-wise, and you either don't use as much energy, you don't use the full 8 kilowatt hours, or maybe you didn't even, your solar system couldn't even charge the battery up to 8 kilowatt hours. So it's important to sort of keep in mind this concept of battery utilization, which is how much of that battery are you actually likely to use. And what we often find is people put in some fairly large batteries, and then given their load profile and how it works over the course of the year, they may only use 15 or 20% of the capacity of the battery on average, which means that really they've sort of oversized the battery, probably overcapitalized a bit, particularly if they don't need it necessarily for sort of reliability reasons. Now it's very hard to work out, well, what would my battery utilization sort of factor be? You can't sort of do that maths in your head, but you can model that, and we do that as part of the consult service that we offer, and a number of other suppliers and consumer organizations can help you work that out by getting your meter data, testing some different solar system sizes and battery sizes, and seeing the optimal size battery given your load. Another important point to remember is that batteries have an efficiency dynamic as well. So just because you put 10 kilowatt hours into the battery, you can't actually get 10 kilowatt hours out. You'll lose some of that energy in losses, both in the charging of the battery and then in the discharging of the battery. Your older style batteries, your lead acid ones, they're a lot worse on this basis. The newer modern lithium batteries are much better, but they're still around sort of a 90% what they call round trip efficiency. So you'll still lose a bit of that energy. Couple of other things we sort of need to touch on is, well, how do you actually fit one of these battery systems in with a solar system? How does it actually work? And there's a couple of ways to what we call couple. How's it connected into the system? There's a couple of ways of doing this. Now this option here, you can see it's called DC coupling. So what it means essentially is you can see you've got a solar panel there, and you've got a solar inverter. This inverter is a fancy inverter. It's called a hybrid solar inverter because it means that it can use electricity from the solar system and the battery, or it can essentially draw energy and work in with the grid. Now this battery here is essentially just plugged in directly to the main solar inverter. So in this system, you just have one set of solar panels, one inverter, and one battery. And it's connected what we call into the sort of the DC side of the inverter. That's a fairly simple system, but it's not an easy system to do if you've got an existing solar system, because if you've got an existing solar PV system, maybe that system is 5 or 10 years old. The inverter that you've got in that system won't be able to control a battery. It won't be smart enough. It won't have the functionality to do that. So you can't just plug a battery into it. These kind of systems are often the way that brand new solar battery systems are set up. The other way to do it is what we call AC coupling, which is where really the battery is sitting on the AC side of the main solar inverter. So what you can see here is you've got your old solar and inverter, you've got your old solar panels and just basic solar inverter. And the battery is really sitting quite separately to that system, and the battery has its own inverter. Remember, batteries operate in DC as well, and that DC needs to be converted to AC so you can use it in the house. So there's a separate second dedicated battery inverter that does that job just for the battery. And so what you end up with here is one set of panels, one battery, but two inverters. And those inverters work separately. And they kind of have sort of separate roles. Now this is the type of system that you're going to need if you're really going to retrofit a battery to most existing solar PV systems, because the old solar inverter will be what we call a dumb inverter and won't be able to work in with the battery. Bit complex. I'm happy to take any questions on that later, but there's sort of your two main ways to deal with how to set a battery up. Economics, touch on this briefly. Look, economics, the reality is that economics are harder still or are less attractive than for batteries than they are with solar PV systems. First point to make is it does vary enormously. Households do have different load profiles. They do pay different tariffs. They can have different solar PV system sizes. The economics of a battery on any given site can vary quite a lot. You can get very good economics on certain sites with grid connected batteries. A lot of them though still they're not, or they're at least nowhere near as attractive as solar. A few other points to make is that the batteries, the grid connected batteries on the market, these things are not like solar that have 25, 30-year asset lives. We're talking about these having design lives of around 10 years. Maybe they'll last a bit longer than that. And it's still difficult to get really a 10-year payback on a battery, particularly in Victoria. Victoria has lower retail tariffs than the rest of the country, which is great, but it sort of works against both solar and batteries to a bit. And we also typically have lower electricity loads because we use so much gas for particularly heating and hot water. So it is difficult to sort of get it to pay itself off in the life of the system. Obviously, if you get the Solar Victoria rebate of about $4,000, then that changes the ball game. But on current prices, without that, it can be difficult. But those homes that have a lot larger energy use, so if you're up above sort of 20 kilowatt hours per day usage and more, or you're on a time of use tariff with a very high peak, particularly in the evenings, or you have a very large existing solar system where you're exporting 90% of the electricity, these ones can actually make sense economically for a battery, and you can get that payback time down below 10 years. And also, if you've got some electricity consumption activities that you just can't shift to the daytime, but they are big loads, then a battery can make sense in that case. Just one other thing on the economic side of things, it's important to remember one sort of dynamic that goes on. This is a table with a range of different solar and battery systems and their costs and bill savings. This is some modelling that we did a couple of years ago. I'm just going to point out two here in the red, just so you can see what's going on. The top one there is a 5 kilowatt solar system, no battery. The cost of the system is about $6,500 and it saves about $1,000 a year on your bills. Pretty good overall economic proposition. The one down the bottom is still the 5 kilowatt solar system, but now you're adding 3 kilowatt hours, a small battery, to that system. Now you can see that just adding the battery roughly doubles the cost. Now we're at $12,500 for the system. So it's twice as expensive, but the bill savings that you get is only about $200 more. And so the overall economics for that system, it pushes out the payback times and makes the return on investment worse. Now that dynamic, that's what happens with solar battery systems. The solar is doing most of the bill savings. The battery helps, but again, depending on your tariffs and your load profile, it may only add, a few $100s a year. It may add more than that, but it sort of doesn't double the bill savings from what you can achieve with solar. Just going to grab a drink of water. On the environmental side, do batteries actually help environmentally? There's really sort of two answers to this question, and it's a bit mixed. The reality is for your individual home, your site, a battery is not a generator. It's not producing more renewable electricity. Your solar system producing the electricity, and the battery is essentially just storing that. Charging it and then discharging later on. And in doing that, it actually loses some of that electricity in the losses slide that I showed before. So it's not as though you're increasing the amount of renewable energy. And so therefore for your site, there's no direct emissions benefit. You're not reducing your tons of carbon from stationary energy each year. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is that in order for us you know, at a grid level or at a societal level, in order for us to get to much higher levels of renewable energy in the grid, if we're going to try and aim for what we would advocate for, which is 100% renewable grid, you need a lot of storage in the grid to do that, because as we all know, renewable energy doesn't generate 24/7. So in that case, storage is actually an enabler of more renewable energy in the grid. So the more households and businesses and other, you know, larger centralized and distributed batteries that they are, the quicker we can get to higher levels of renewable energy. So on that front, it does have what we say sort of an indirect environmental benefit, and storage is really important for our energy transition. Warranties are always very important to look at the warranties on these things. Warranties with batteries are also a bit complex, a bit like with the solar. First point to make is that batteries, like solar, they degrade over time, like any technology really. Solar panels, after 20-25 years, generally will put out about 80% of their original rated capacity. Batteries are similar, but they actually do that over a shorter time frame. So the better ones in the market, you'll see after 10 years, they will warrant that they will still be able to store 80% of their original capacity. So if you had a 10 kilowatt hour battery, it might warrant that it will still be able to store 8 kilowatt hours in year 10. But we have seen that percentage figure be a lot lower than that, 70% or even 60% after 10 years. So, you know, how much is actually warranted over what time period is actually really important. And also how many cycles are warranted. Ideally, you want to get, you know, 1 cycle per day. So a full charge and a discharge warranted per day for the entire design life, which might be 10 years. Sometimes you might see that it'll say, 2,000 cycles or 3,000 cycles, which might be less than a daily charge discharge over that time period. So need to understand that and be clear about what they're offering in terms of a warranty. There might be some other minimum kind of operating requirements or conditions that you need to meet as well, which is important to both bear in mind and also compare across different battery products. Chemistries, I'm not a chemical engineer, so I don't want to touch on this too much, but just to say that yes, there are different chemistries out there, but the reality is that the modern grid-connected batteries that are going in are really based around lithium technology, variants of lithium-ion technology. Your older style batteries are your lead acid, different variations of lead acid batteries, and they are, you know, those batteries are cheaper to buy, but you can't get as much energy sort of density out of them, and they have far more complex sort of operating parameters, and they're not very suitable for particularly grid connected situations. There's a few other technologies that have been sort of sitting there for a while, flow batteries, which is using liquid, sodium batteries using salt water, but these ones, particularly in the residential market, are still nowhere near the commerciality or the readiness of lithium batteries. And so most of the ones you see on the market will be some variant of lithium ion technology. Quick slide on off-grid. Lots of people ask us about the ability to go off-grid. What I've been focusing on so far is really the situation where you've got a grid connection. So you're connected to the grid, you're partly reliant on your own solar and or solar battery electricity, and you're partly reliant on the grid. To go off grid is a vastly different ballgame. You've actually got there's a lot more to the design process to work out what you need in order to go off grid. You need a lot more system components for the solar battery system to do that. It'll be much larger components and much more expensive. Generally speaking, not always, but historically people have always had backup generations. So generally it's a diesel or petrol generator in order to get through the worst weeks in winter. If you get a large enough solar and battery system, maybe you don't need that. But you have to think really carefully about your electrical loads in winter, particularly your heating and hot water. How are you going to deliver those loads in winter, and are you going to do it with efficient electric technology or maybe not electrical technology at all? Because that's the main challenge. Your off-grid system is fine in summer, but it can be difficult to get through in the winter. And those systems are unfortunately not cheap. They vary enormously in cost because their design varies a lot, but you can generally work on a very rough rule of thumb of around $5,000 per kilowatt hour of load or of usage that you have. Now, the typical Melbourne home uses about 12 kilowatt hours per day of electricity. That's not including heating and hot water. And so if you wanted 12 kilowatt hours per day average, that system would cost you about $60,000. So these things are not cheap, but we do it. We have members that are off-grid in Melbourne, in the city, and many more in the country as well, but a lot more design aspects to those. Quickly touch on just other storage options. As I sort of said at the start of the presentation, your hot water system, particularly if you've got a hot water system with a tank and it's electric-based system, these are batteries. You can run these during the daytime. They will store solar energy for use later on as in the hot water later on, showers in the evening or next morning or what have you. These are great and are actually a lot cheaper storage than lithium-ion technology for batteries. Lithium technology, really, you can work on about the starting price of about $1,000 a kilowatt hour. These hot water systems, either heat pump or even electric resistive hot water systems, can store energy for about a quarter of that cost, about $250 a kilowatt hour. Your heat pumps, I mean, the two main types here, your electric storage is just your old inefficient, just your big kettles, a big tank with the element in it. Not efficient, not environmentally friendly unless you can actually run the whole thing from solar. If you've got a large enough solar system, you might be able to. Your heat pump is your modern efficient electric technology, uses around 75% less electricity than an electric storage system. And you can easily cover, if you run it during the daytime, you can easily cover the entire hot water load from even sort of a medium-sized solar system. Yeah, other ways still, you know, maximising your solar consumption in other ways. We've talked a bit about appliances and heating and cooling. That's still what you want to do, and that might mean that you don't have to install a battery at all, or you can get a smaller battery. You can also get fancy, what we call diverter devices, where your excess solar can actually be put into hot water systems or other what we call resistive loads, water pumping, in order to maximize the use of your solar without necessarily getting a battery. A couple more slides, I think we'll do questions. So just some main kind of pitfalls to avoid when thinking about a battery system. Probably the key one, which we see a fair bit, we used to see a lot, is that people think that all batteries can actually allow you to operate independently from the grid. A lot of them can't, a lot of them can, but you need to actually specify that if you want that in looking at a battery system. Those systems are a bit more expensive. There's a bit more kit and sort of infrastructure set up to do that, but it certainly can be done. And if you're going to do that, you need to have a sufficiently sized battery in order to be able to allow you to operate off grid. So if you want, you need to understand, well, if we actually have a prolonged blackout, what appliances do I want to be able to run and for how long? And then you need to size the battery to that size. And that might be a larger battery than you would otherwise normally need. Grid connections, always an issue. What is the size system you can actually connect to the grid? Something that you need to talk to an installer about and seeing what's possible there. Location is very important with batteries. There's standards and installation guidelines around this, but essentially you're trying to avoid high temperature locations. They do need good ventilation requirements, mostly for the older style systems though. And then just the placement of them. A lot of them are put in garages, but you know, some of these batteries can be pretty big units too. So need to be out of the way of cars and other things going on in sheds or in storage areas. Making sure that you use actually an experienced installer. As I said before, batteries haven't been around, grid-connected household batteries haven't been around anywhere near as long as solar PV systems. So you want to be working with an installer who has done a number of these installs before and is very familiar with the setup. And yeah, being aware of the warranty conditions, understanding those and understanding how they'll play out over particularly 10 years if something goes wrong. Yeah, so takeaway messages there, you know, be aware they are a bit more complex than solar, but you know, if you do that kind of the homework first, maybe, you know, get a consult or talk to a number of different installers, try and understand the optimal size and design for your site. And also, if you're thinking about a battery, but you haven't got solar and you want to do that, you can always do solar now and add a battery later in terms of AC coupling it, like I was talking about before. It's not something that you need to necessarily delay on. And last slide, there's just a number of different links for resources. You've got our magazines and consults in there. The Clean Energy Council's got an approved battery list, which is worth looking at. You shouldn't really be investing in a grid-connected battery that's not on that list. There's a great comparison table there, that solar quotes link, the second one from the bottom. That's a fantastic online data table of all the different batteries available on the market, and it shows their prices and their system components and whether or not they have an inbuilt inverter or not, and all their different specs. And you can look at that table and compare different types of products on the market. And there's also a price benchmark sort of database that Solar Choice offers as well. I think this presentation will be sort of sent out afterwards, I think, so we'll have those links to rely on. And I think I'll stop there and see if we've got questions.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions to go through, Damien. Okay, so Judith asks whether solar panels need to be cleaned, and if so, is it hard?
Yeah, good question. Yes, they do. They should. I mean, they don't have to be cleaned. You could leave them there for 25 years and never clean them. And what will happen is that you get soiling and dirt sort of build up on the panels, and that will affect their performance. The longer you leave it, the performance will reduce, reduce. So yes, it's a good idea. Generally, our advice is, no, it doesn't have to be every year, but once every 2 or 3 years, get an installer out to do a system check. They offer this generally often around sort of $200 to $300. They'll come out for a couple of hours. They will clean the panels. They will test the inverter, make sure the system is still putting out what it should be putting out given the age of the system, and let you know if there's any, problems with the system in any way. You could do that annually. The amount that you lose through not cleaning the panels is not a lot over the course of a year, but over the course of 5 or 10 years, it starts to build up. So yeah, definitely worth doing. Okay,
Davis is asking if you know of anyone who does mock-up images to show what solar panels would look like on your house.
Yes, basically all installers now do that. So what generally happens is that if you call for quotes, you fire off a few emails to some different installers. They generally, to start with, won't come out on site. They'll do a Google Earth. Sort of check, and they will do an image and a placement of a certain number of panels, certain configuration on your site using Google Earth, and they will provide you sort of a high level quote on that basis, and then that'll be subject to when they actually come out on site and finalize the quote, because they can't necessarily check shading, and they can't necessarily check your switchboard and other, the battens in your roof to see exactly where the panels would be fixed to. And so, they'll come out and sort of finalize that quote. And if they need to adjust for various pricing aspects, they'll do that then. But yeah, you'll be able to get an initial high level quote with an image to see where they think from a desktop perspective, the optimal siting and placement might be.
Great. Barry's asking, how do you work out how many panels can fit on your roof?
You can do a very rough calc, and you can say that a panel is basically a bit smaller than 2 square meters. So it's a bit smaller than 1 meter by 2 meters. That's kind of the rough area. So you could jump onto Google Earth and just trace an area of your roof, ideally a north or an east or a western plane or multiples of those, and then try and see if you can work out yourself how many panels you would fit on that. And then once you work out roughly how many panels, then you can assume that basically, panels these days range generally between about, one panel will be somewhere between 300 and 400 watts. So you can work on about roughly 3 panels to a kilowatt. So if you could fit 9 panels on there, that'd give you about a 3 kilowatt system. You know, if you could fit 30 panels on there, that'll get you to sort of almost a 10 kilowatt system. So, yeah.
Helen's asking what rebates are available for upgrading to a 1.5 kilowatt system to large enough to get a battery.
Yeah, well, that's going to be tricky. So if you've got one of the original 1.5 kilowatt systems and you're wanting more solar capacity, it's a bit like the question from the first part of the session. You're not going to be able to just add panels to that system. You're going to need to stick in basically a separate system. I imagine your system is probably in the order of 10 years old. The panels on that system might be 150, 200 watts. They'll be half the wattage of current modern day panels on the market, so that you won't be able to feed new panels into the same inverter. So you'll need a second solar panel system with its own new inverter. And really you'd be hooking up a battery to that system and not the old system. Whether you can grid connect both of those systems is going to be a question. You may not be able to, in which case you would probably disconnect from the grid, the old system, and just use that to run specific loads in the house or the shed. And you'd look at the new system, which is larger. See, a 1.5 kilowatt system is not really going to be able to provide much energy to charge a battery. You're going to need a larger system to do that.
Greg is asking whether a premium is attached to home insurance when a battery is installed.
Whether a premium is attached. I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you mean that should you get insurance for a battery being installed or even solar, yes, you should list it on your home insurance, absolutely. Does it put up the cost of your insurance? I'm not sure. It's probably a case-by-case basis. I've certainly got ours listed. I can't recall if it actually really noticeably changed the premium or not. If it does, I wouldn't think it would be by a long way.
Kristen is asking, can the grid cope with all the additional loads from solar? I've heard that it's currently operation above capacity at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great question, very relevant. So yes, I mean, it's not over capacity at the moment, but the reality is that more and more solar is getting put in. What happens with solar when you have a lot of solar in a local street or in a local neighborhood? What happens is when you get more and more export, particularly like a day like today, a spring day, nice sunny day, there's not a lot of heating or cooling going on, and so you get a lot of export from the solar systems into the grid. It pushes the voltage up in the local grid, and the grid network company, they have to manage the voltage within a certain range. It can't go above a certain level, otherwise things start to not work. So it is going to be increasingly an issue, but there are technical solutions to that. We've just done a report at Renew on what those solutions are, and one of the main ones is actually changing the voltage at the transformer that comes into the street. You can lower that and allow more solar to be installed. But what's happened in practice in Victoria is that, yes, networks are reducing the amount of solar, the size that people are allowed to put in. Traditionally, for single phase homes, you could put in up to 10 kilowatts, but in lots of parts of Victoria now, networks are limiting people to only 5 kilowatts at the inverter. You can put a few more panels on than that, but you might find that you're limited to 5 kilowatts. In some parts where reliability is really bad in regional areas, you might be limited to less than that.
And Logan is asking whether you see sharing solar or battery output with neighbours, for example, microgrids or virtual power plants, as a realistic next step.
Virtual power plants certainly are. They're happening. They're not happening in Victoria anywhere near as much as particularly South Australia or Queensland. Those VPPs, they're essentially sharing the battery energy with the retailer or the energy network company. It's not as though you're directly sharing the energy with your neighbour. The reality is the electrons are being shared, but from an energy retail bill point of view, at the end of the day, where your electricity meter is, that's where your energy retailer acts. That's where they legally buy energy from you if you're exporting energy, and may then go and on-sell that to somebody else. So there's no real kind of mechanism still to directly trade energy with your neighbours, but the VPP program is a bit different than that, but they certainly do have a role in terms of both network management and reducing the electricity retailers' price that they need to buy energy for on the wholesale market in peak times. So they're very good. Microgrids start to get into, well, how's the grid actually operating differently than the normal grid? Generally, in the normal grid, we all have individual grid connections, and there's a retailer acting at your meter, and that's it. Microgrids, you can start to look at systems where you have a separate network arrangement, which might be entirely off grid from the main grid, or it might have only one point of connection to the grid, like an apartment block or maybe a greenfields estate. And yeah, there's certainly some opportunities in those areas too.
And Helen's asking, how are cleaners accredited? She says she has a friend whose panels got damaged during cleaning.
Right, that's fairly unfortunate. I can't imagine how that would have happened. That it shouldn't. Cleaning panels is not a very high risk job, so whoever did that, if it was an installer, that's a fairly poor outcome, and I would have thought you would have had direct recourse over that if they've damaged a panel from walking on it or dropping something on it, dropping tools on it or something, then that fault exists with them, and they should be replacing that panel so that the system still works correctly. That's very rare. I haven't really heard of that before, just from cleaning. The reality is with cleaning is some people clean panels themselves, and they basically stand on the ground with the hose and fire water up there. Like, cleaning doesn't have to be too hard a job to do. So if that's happened, that's quite unfortunate. But I would have thought the installer would be liable to repair that.
And Heather's asking, how do I find out if there are limits to my solar system capacity as per the grid capacity?
Well, generally you can work on at the moment 5 kilowatts per phase. So if you have a single phase house, single phase connection, then you should be able to connect a minimum of 5 kilowatts at the inverter. And you can actually oversize the panels to the inverter by about 1.3. So what that means is you could put about a 6.5 kilowatt system of panels on a 5 kilowatt inverter. And that's still a very significant size system. You get a lot of benefit from that system. Most people in Melbourne, most people in Victoria are still able to connect at that level, but in some weaker areas of the network, some electricity networks are saying, no, it's actually 2.5 or 3 kilowatts maximum capacity at the inverter. And then in a small number of cases, they're actually saying it's 0. So you can have a solar system and you can use that solar energy on site to run your appliances, but you can't export any electricity into the grid. That's rare, but there are cases of that.
Okay, so Rose has asked what we think are the barriers to take up and what can council do about it. So just Damien, what do you think are the barriers? I mean, I have a few ideas, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah. Look, the barriers to batteries for me is fairly straightforward. It's the fact that batteries are still expensive. So basically, really a battery is like, give or take, a $10,000 plus investment. And yeah, the sort of economic returns or the savings you get on that is sort of nowhere near what you get out of solar. So that's that. We really do need there's not a lot of technical barriers to batteries. If batteries can actually solve a lot of the technical issues that we have in the grid and can help in a lot of other areas, the main one there is just getting the prices of the technology to come down. With solar, there hasn't been a lot of barriers with solar. Australia's got the largest uptake of rooftop solar, particularly residential, in the world by far. So those the barriers there hasn't been too many in the last 10 years, but coming up, the kind of grid constraint technical issues we were just talking about, that will become probably more of an issue and may prevent some people from putting it on. And I guess, apartment blocks, renters, your other kind of sites, which are not just standalone or semi-detached dwellings, those will always be harder. There are solutions though in the market now for more equitably sharing solar in apartment blocks, and there are solutions like financing solutions I was talking about for renters. They'll always be more challenging projects, but hopefully those will smooth those pathways to some extent. But yeah, Deanna, you might have some ideas too.
Yeah, I think some of the barriers that have been expressed to us include things like knowing, where to start and, and who to trust. I often field queries from our residents with regards to those kinds of questions. And, and the way in which we usually address that is we provide information on where to start, essentially on our website, which is on the MVCC website. We have a page dedicated to living sustainably, and there's a particular page there that addresses where to start and what sort of things, particularly around the rebates and suppliers, and we refer them to the links that we provide on that page. One of the other things that people have expressed to us with regards to barriers are particularly those with houses, in heritage overlay areas. And so one of the things that we're also doing to address that is we're conducting a review into that process to see, what we can do to reduce that particular barrier. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So we still have a few more, Damien, is that okay? We just keep going for a little bit longer? Okay. So Kristen's asked, are there plans to ensure the grid can meet increases in loads made by solar?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. So solar's not a load, solar's a generator. So it's generating more electricity. And the interesting case there is really South Australia. So, Victoria, the eastern states, big cities, they're not experiencing quite the issues that are going on in South Australia at the moment. In South Australia, there's the situation where, first of all, there's much more solar. There's actually about sort of 30% more than up to even 40% in some parts of their network of homes have solar, and they have a much lower electricity load overall as a state. So what's happening in that state is that this spring, for the first time ever, possibly in the world, there'll probably be some days this spring, like Sundays, when there's not that much electricity consumption going on, where rooftop solar will generate more electricity for maybe a few hours than the entire state's load. Now that's not actually in and of itself an absolute problem, but it's certainly something that's new and needs to be managed. And yeah, down the track in 5 or 10 years' time, maybe Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland will start to approach that issue as well, where that there's actually too much generation and there isn't the load there to meet it. Because within an electricity system, you are trying to roughly balance generation and load most of the time. So, there's different schools of thought on that. I mean, one school of thought is that as we go along over the next 5 to 10 years, electricity is going to become more and more important for lots of different reasons, climate and carbon reasons being some, but also other reasons. Electricity technology is advancing a lot faster than any of your other fossil fuel-based technology. And so what's happening is, I mean, we can see with residential already, people are starting to convert, particularly their big loads like heating and hot water, to electric. People are building all electric new homes, and that's increasing part of the market. And then of course, you've got electric vehicles coming along, which if you replace the entire car fleet on the road now to electric vehicles, it would easily double the electricity load of the national electricity market. So yes, rooftop solar and renewable generation is increasing, but the reality is in the future that electricity demand will also increase, and the challenge is to try and make those balance out as you're increasing sort of both sides of the equation.
Costa's asked, how many kilowatt hours do you require to produce on a daily basis to be able to run all your appliances?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The context for that is do you have electricity and gas or not, or are you electricity only? If you're electricity and gas at home, the typical Melbourne home uses about 10 to 12 kilowatt hours a day of electricity, and they use a lot more gas. They use about 45 to 50 gigajoules, or 45,000 to 50,000 megajoules of gas per year. So what that means is actually most of your stationary energy use, it's actually being supplied by gas, not by electricity. So now your 12 kilowatt hours a day, that'll just be everything else. It'll be your fridge and white goods and computers and TV and lights and all that sort of stuff. If you have an all electric home where you start converting things to electricity, particularly your hot water and heating, and for most homes in Melbourne or Victoria, that's about 3/4 of your energy use. If you convert that to electricity, you'll roughly probably double, maybe not quite double your electricity load. So you'll go up to sort of 15, 20 kilowatt hours a day, maybe a bit more. And that profile will vary. It probably won't be 15 or 20 in summer, but if you're running heating and hot water on electricity, it will go above 20 kilowatt hours a day in winter. And so that then, that sort of brings back the point around, if you're going to do solar and batteries, you need to think about, well, these are long-lived assets. You're going to have these systems for 10, 20, 30 years. You need to think about, first of all, are you going to be in the house that long? And secondly, how are you planning to manage your appliances over that long time frame as well? And take that overall kind of energy management sort of approach to designing the whole system. The solar is just one part of how you should manage energy across the site.
So Greg is saying, for older residents in homes that will likely be demolished when we pass on, are there any advantages or more portable systems that could be sold?
Yeah, well, portable as in, so you can buy some solar panels like camping ones, for example, or bigger ones than that, they're not connected to the grid. They can be connected, and batteries as well. I mean, a battery is a portable system. I mean, I've got one here sort of sitting next to my desk, which again is sort of a camping unit. So those ones, yeah, they can be plugged in or connected to specific appliances or specific loads and run those loads. Will it be cost effective to do that? Probably not. Having a really small, you sort of get a bit of economies of scale with solar and storage technology. So, a solar and battery system that could run your fridge, say, you could just take it off the wall and just plug it into a standalone solar battery system. That solar battery system will probably cost you, $2,500. So it's not really necessarily a cost-effective way to go, but essentially solar and batteries are portable these days. They're modular, and there's all sorts of different products on the market. So I think if you were thinking about that, you would probably start with some of the camping sort of design systems and see if those kind of would suit your needs.
Okay, and I think this might be our last question, Damien. There are more, but I don't think we'll get a chance to address them all. But lucky last, Jen says, I am one of 4 units under the same roof line and want to encourage the other owners to do a joint solar purchase and installation. Would there be a discount for a group purchase?
Yeah, good question. Discount, yeah, I mean, put it this way, it's a good way to go to get a system that would work for all 4 dwellings. So as a project, the way I would approach that is to look at the bills of the 4 dwellings and get the meter data for the 4 dwellings and add it all up. And yeah, from an economies of scale point of view, you're better off doing a solar project or a solar battery project that works for the whole site rather than just for one dwelling. When you've got larger loads, then the performance and the economics of solar and battery systems improves. The challenge you've sort of got there is it'll come back to how many meters do you have? So with the 4 dwellings, is there 4 separate meters or is there 1 meter? If there's 1 meter, it's easy. You put the solar and battery system behind that 1 meter and it'll provide benefits to everybody. If there's 4 separate meters, then the challenge is that the solar and or battery system is generally only benefiting one of the meters because it's sitting behind one of the meters. There is some technology on the market called, it's the only one that really exists for apartment blocks and sort of multi-tenant developments, and it's called Loom. It's called the SolShare technology by Loom, and it's some technology which allows you to have one solar system and you can have it generating electricity, and it will provide that energy to multiple different metering points, and so it can benefit everybody in that multi-unit arrangement. It's going well at the moment, that technology, and looks like a good solution for those sort of situations. So you would need to do a little bit of feasibility work around that. What will a system cost and how much will everybody benefit, and do a little bit of assessment with a qualified, you could do it with us through a consult or with an installer, and then take that to your, probably a body corporate that you work through and get people to hopefully get their interest up and get them keen to go ahead with the project.
Okay, Damien, great, thank you. I think we'll probably wrap it up there for today's session. So thank you once again for a terrific presentation, really informative presentation, and lots of really good questions. So once again, thank you. And to everyone who's still with us, the link will be sent to all those people that registered for today's event. So once again, thank you, and all the best, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Damien. Bye.